My name is Stephanie Stillo, and I am Chief of the Rare Book and Special Collections Division here at the library, and it is genuinely my privilege to welcome you to the Library of Congress. Thank you guys for coming. It's lovely to see you. We are here celebrating Women's History Month, and part of that is also welcoming Rebecca back to her research stomping grounds, so we're very excited to have her back. Now, I will be honest that it is always a thrill to invite speakers to the library to talk about their research in our collections. There is a singular joy of seeing our beloved collections find wider audiences in publications. For librarians, it is a transcendent experience. But I have to say that I am especially pleased to have the opportunity to invite Rebecca to the library. In her previous role as the editor of Fine Books and Collections magazine, she often helped the Rare Book Division broadcast our own successes. I am truly thrilled to now have the opportunity to similarly celebrate hers. Rebecca started out in the book business at Simon & Schuster after graduating from Syracuse University with a dual bachelor's degree in English and magazine journalism. She then earned a master's degree in book history from Drew University with a thesis on reprinted editions of classic books, which was awarded the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading, and Publishing's Graduate Essay Prize. Rebecca was the longtime editor of Fine Books and Collections magazine. This is a publication that is crucial to the field of rare book librarianship. I am a big fan. She currently serves as the Director of Communication at the Robb Collection, a firm that buys and sells historical autographs and documents. Tonight, Rebecca will be joined on stage by Amanda Zimmerman. Amanda hardly needs introduction at the Library of Congress, but I like to embarrass her, so I will go ahead and do so anyway. Amanda can best be described as a professional Swiss Army knife. She has been a junior fellow, a curatorial assistant, a technician, and she is now a senior reference librarian in the Rare Book and Special Collections Reading Room. Amanda has an MLIS and a master's degree in American history with a focus on public history. She specializes in 19th and 20th century literature and pop culture, and she is our resident expert at anything associated with the occult, magic, and, as we like to say, anything that's just kind of weird in the division. Thank you, Amanda. We got a lot of weird stuff. So a little bit about our run of show for the evening. Rebecca is going to give us a short presentation about her book, and then Amanda will lead us all in a discussion with Rebecca, which will certainly include some time for you all to ask questions. Rebecca will then offer a book signing in the back, and there's also a small display of rare book material in the back of the room, which is overseen by another of my exceptional colleagues, Marianne Estelle, in the back there. So please make sure that you check that out before you leave for the evening. So I am going to stop talking and cede the floor to Rebecca.
Thank you all for attending tonight. It is an incredible honor to be at the Library of Congress to talk about the lost legacy of the author and book collector Carolyn Wells. And before I jump in, I'm so pleased to report that we have some of Carolyn's family with us here tonight. We have her grandniece, Phyllis Gibson, and her great-grandnephew, Peter Gibson. And I want to say that Phyllis was instrumental in the research and writing of this book, and I am so grateful, and I'm so thrilled that you could be here tonight. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the book, because unless you're related to me or to them, you probably don't know who Carolyn Wells was, even though she wrote 150 books. So that's why I wrote The Vanishing of Carolyn Wells, and I'm going to share just a little highlight reel of her life. She was born in 1862 in the central New Jersey town of Rahway. The Wells family was upper middle class, father at work in the city, mother at home, domestic help that allowed Carolyn's youth to be filled with social events and church events and amateur theatricals and long summer vacations. Of her siblings, 2 died as children, and during the bout of scarlet fever that took away her sister, she actually lost hearing in one of her ears, and that was a disability that she had to live with for the rest of her life. Even though she tried many, many painful curatives, nothing ever succeeded. Hers was not a house filled with books. In fact, Carolyn's father tried to censor her reading. She was allowed to read the Bible or Shakespeare. But then at the age of 11, she found the public library and she started reading on her own. And even before that, she was a very precocious child. She says in her memoir that she knew the alphabet by 18 months and she was reading like any adult by the age of 3. And this tiny booklet that we're looking at right here is something that she self-published when she was 6. She wrote the whole thing. It really reminds me of the Bronte family. They used to do this kind of thing where they would write little books for each other. And you can see she signed it Carrie Wells. She was actually born Carrie, and she changed it later to Carolyn. But I think it really does reveal this budding literary talent. She graduated as valedictorian, but she refused the opportunity to go to college. She flippantly declared that she didn't want to have to go somewhere and make her own bed every day. So instead, she set a course of study that included German, French, history, botany, and 3 summers' worth of Shakespeare in Amherst, Massachusetts. Here is 2 portraits of Carolyn around the age of 30. So this is the 1890s. She looks quite conventional, and she largely was pretty conventional in how she looked at life. However, she did not rush to get married, as would have been expected for a woman of her time and genteel social class. Instead, she took a job at the local public library, which frankly was also a little unusual because it was considered crass for women to earn money. But she had a wonderful mentor there, and the job gave her the opportunity not only to travel, but to read a lot. And she discovered, as a librarian, the world of what we now call little magazines. These are avant-garde literary magazines that kind of sprung up in the shadow of larger progressive magazines. And knowing that she had a knack for poetry and puzzles and wordplay, she tried pitching her work to some of these magazines. And here, the one on the right is a quintessential little magazine, very low circulation, but really literary and progressive. It's called The Lark. It was published out of San Francisco. And the first time she tried to pitch the editor, Gillette Burgess, on her material, he told her, quote, "No women contributors, thank you." But instead of getting angry about that, she just continued pitching him one story after the next, one poem after the next, until he broke down and not only gave her a byline in the magazine, but she ended up being one of the editors, and she and Gillette were lifelong friends and collaborators, so it all worked out in the end. And on the left there, you can see Puck, which is a famous humor magazine out of New York City. If you've ever seen the Puck building downtown, it's named for that publishing house. And it was mostly comic writing, poetry, limericks were one of her great fortes. So she's working at the library during this whole time. She's got a job at the library, but she's trying to make this leap into the literary world. And it finally really comes together when she publishes her first book, which is called At the Sign of the Sphinx, published in 1896. It is, in essence, a book of riddles, so along the same lines as wordplay and puzzles. So it was very on brand, as they say today. And while she does not publish another book for 3 years, she is producing and publishing tons of material for magazines, especially at this time, poetry, prose, and puzzles for the children's magazine St. Nicholas under editor Mary Mapes Dodge. She's also writing comic verse and stories for Harper's, Life, the Saturday Evening Post. So during this time, the late 1890s and the turn of the century, she really goes from being, I don't want to call her a literary nobody, but just a librarian working in central New Jersey to being a person whose name is in every major magazine all the time, every issue. Her name is everywhere, and she's all of a sudden considered the funniest woman in America, which is how she comes to be invited to give the keynote poem at Mark Twain's splashy 70th birthday party. And it's really hard to imagine how she's juggling all of this writing, but she finally gave up her day job in 1902. She was 40 years old, and she's also at the same time just starting several series of young adult novels, filling what was a wide open niche at the time. The whole idea of young adult literature was really just coming into being, and she swooped in and started filling that niche. Her Patty books were especially popular. She wrote and published 17 of them from 1901 to 1919, but they were reprinted well into the 40s and 50s. They were beloved by generations of girls, and parents loved them, librarians loved them, because they were considered acceptable, wholesome reading, which had been a space primarily reserved for Louisa May Alcott. And so she's doing all of that, and then she also launches a series of highly praised anthologies, satire, parody, nonsense verse, with the publisher Scribner. So in the first decade of the 20th century, there were years where she was publishing 6, 7, 8 books per year with as many publishers. She was just everywhere. And I think it's important to note here, too, that Carolyn was also a very social person. So although she continued to live in her parents' home in New Jersey, because that is what would have been expected of a woman who was unmarried at the time, she frequently traveled to New York City for literary events and occasions where she often met up with fellow women writers like Kate Douglas Wiggin. She wrote Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm, and Frances Hodgson Burnett, who wrote The Secret Garden. She was also a member of the really exclusive Colony Club, where she lunched with Mrs. Roosevelt and Mrs. Custer and Mrs. Edison, to name a few. I should also say that Carolyn was acquainted with 4 different presidents, and she had a very particular friendship with Mr. and Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt. She was invited to the White House and Sagamore Hill, and she dedicated books to them, and they wrote to each other. So she really just found a way to make a lot of friendships. She reaches something of a pinnacle moment as a writer and then makes just an absolute sharp turn into something new. She had long been a fan of the detective novel, specifically Edgar Allan Poe and Arthur Conan Doyle. And she had collected a few hundred editions of detective novels at the time, a little reading library for herself, which she actually ends up giving away to some friends. But in the first decade of the 20th century, she published a few mystery short stories, and I guess she felt like she was pretty good at it. So she publishes her first novel. Actually, there's a slide I missed from before. There's a few of the books that she was publishing in this first decade of the 20th century, and you can tell it's just a kind of a great mixture of genres. She's got poetry and an anthology and a children's book and young adult literature, and also just really beautiful decorative bindings. So this is what I was mentioning before, The Clue, which is her first detective novel. It comes out in 1909, and this is going to be the first of 61 detective novels that she's going to write. And some of them were turned into silent films with Thomas Edison and other early filmmakers, and some of them became bestsellers. She wrote what we call now locked room or country house mysteries, and similar to what Agatha Christie would do, but Carolyn Wells was doing it a decade before Agatha Christie. And it's really hard to overestimate how popular she was with readers of her mysteries. Some of these titles sold 10 or 15,000 copies per book, which at the time was absolutely huge. And she also enjoyed translations. She was published in the UK. A public library study from the time had her listed as one of the top most borrowed authors. So she was frankly so famous by the late 30s that Milton Bradley licensed her name for a card game called Carolyn Wells' fascinating mystery game, G-Men. I have one, and it's actually pretty impossible to play. It's very complicated. But I think that gives you some sense of the level of fame that she achieved as an author. And I'm just going to backtrack. Well, no, I'm going to backtrack. I'm going to vote forward. Carolyn finally did get married in 1918 at the age of 55, and they moved to New York City, where she would live for the last 24 years of her life. And it's during this time that she becomes a serious book collector. She's still writing 3 or 4 mysteries per year. She's just churning them out. But her main occupation at the time becomes book collecting. And you can see here 2 variations of her book plate. The one on the right, you can see that is actually her. That's her face on this Renaissance-clad woman, and she's holding in her hands this little gargoyle. He's called the Lincoln Imp. He actually is a real thing in a statue in the Lincoln Cathedral in the UK. And he's on the other bookplate as well, so I think she thought of him as a little bit of a spirit animal. She considered herself a bit of an imp, so I guess that's the connection. She was very much an Anglophile. She traveled to England annually, and her focus for book collecting turns out to be mostly Walt Whitman, although she kind of was all over the place, but she focuses it on Walt Whitman. And I'm just going to show you a few items of note from that time period. You can see here the bibliography that she creates. I mean, she starts collecting in 1919, and by 1922, she has pretty much the largest and best collection of Walt Whitman in the world. And she is convinced by her bookseller, Alfred Goldsmith, to put together a bibliography. And she didn't really want to do it because she didn't think she had the bona fides to do it. And he said, we'll just do a checklist. And so they end up publishing this book. And it's a standard reference for 50 or 70 years. So, and then there is a first edition of Leaves of Grass, which you can actually see in the book display back there. So see it in person, not here. The core of the collection was 100 copies of Leaves of Grass, 100 editions of that book, and she called herself a Leaves of Grass hopper. During the 20s and 30s, Carolyn was very involved in the rare book world while keeping up a years-long feud with a fellow collector, which maybe we'll talk about later. She wrote about book collecting and poetry and prose for mainstream magazines. She was one of the editors of the Colophon, which was a high aesthetic journal for bibliophiles. She corresponded with fellow collectors, and when she traveled, she went to the local bookshops. And here is a letter. On the right, you'll see a letter of hers, which she wrote to her best friend Harriet about going to the Walden bookshop and buying a copy of A Week on the Concord and Merrimack for $300. And there on the left might be that very copy. And these two items are actually in my collection, as I, too, am a collector. Carolyn used her knowledge of the rare book world in her fiction, too, publishing Murder in the Bookshop, perhaps her most well-known mystery in 1936. The plot involves the theft of a book signed by Button Gwinnett, who is a real person. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and he signed it, and then he was killed in a duel like a month later, so his autograph is considered the rarest of all the signers. And in this book, there's a copy of a book signed by Button Gwinnett, and somebody really wants it, so they not only steal it, they murder the collector in the bookshop. And so that's the plot of it. It really appealed to contemporary readers. It was actually a New York Times bestseller, and it's super collectible today. You really can't go to an antiquarian bookstore without seeing at least one of them. And I want to introduce you quickly to something else that was very important to Carolyn, and it's what she called her mermaid, At the Sign of the Mermaid. This is a scrapbook, an album that she collected. Over decades, she would ask all the authors and artists that she worked with to create, not just sign a book, but create something, create a piece of art, write a verse, something that would be interesting. And she collected these for decades. And then she asked Belle DaCosta Green, who was the librarian of the J.P. Morgan Library, to commission a binding for it. And it turned into this red Morocco binding is what they come out with, and it's a stunning volume. And what you're seeing here is the hand-lettered title page, and then in the middle you're seeing an original Gibson Girl, and there on the right you're seeing some verses from Theodore Roosevelt from the White House. So finding out about this album, that it had survived, was one of the make-or-break points of my project, and it's kind of a good segue into the research process that we're going to talk about in a little bit. One of my critics, when they were reviewing the book, they called the book a process biography, which is actually a phrase I like a lot. And I think what he meant was that it's part biography and part sleuthing around for the archival bits and pieces. And I went into this whole project with really two overarching questions. One, who was Carolyn Wells? And because I had spent 15 years as a journalist covering rare books, auctions, and art and antiques, the second was, where did all her stuff go? So finding these answers I felt would be an act of recovery. It was really my intention to recall to the literary world the name Carolyn Wells and to wrestle back some of the recognition that I feel she deserves, which is one of the many reasons tonight's event is so very special. And one last slide, Carolyn in her library, 1937, probably the last photo taken of her. She died in 1942. And I love this photo because you can see her library in the backdrop. I have never seen another photo like this of her in her space with her library. And it could be that that's some of the Walt Whitman collection there behind her. The books you're seeing in that photo are the books that are in this building, some of the books back there on the table, preserved for the nation, and that is what I find very touching about it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. We're now going to move into the Q&A section. So Amanda and Rebecca are going to kick us off on some conversation, and then we are going to go ahead and open it up for y'all to ask questions as well. So, we're going to let Amanda take it from here.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. So excited to have you all here. The first thing I have to say before we really get started is that I felt such an immediate kinship with Carolyn for a number of reasons. One, she is a librarian. Two, she is a lover of nonsense verse and mysteries, which I also can say for myself. And finally, she is a proud New Jerseyan, as I am. And so I just felt immediately drawn to Carolyn. And it was really a joy for me to discover her through this book. So I wanted to start, we just heard so much about Carolyn, and I thought it would be really great if we could start by talking about her as an author. And what I was really struck with when reading the book is just the absolute flurry of activity that is Carolyn's creative output. I mean, you spoke about it a bit, right? She's producing 6-7 books per year for different genres, for different publishers. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about the process of organizing the narrative. There's this really great choose your own adventure moment at the end of chapter 2, and I was hoping you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I did it that way. I do have a little choose your own adventure moment, and it's because she was publishing so much that I thought if I were just going in sort of a, just going through her life year by year, I'd be filling the narrative with just title after title after title, and I thought that would get really tiring to read. So I thought, let's just break it up. I mean, there's just way too much happening all the time. I'm not sure why she went from 0 to 60, or how, and that it all happened in kind of the second half of her life. It's really intriguing. And she did it all largely without an agent, without a helper of any kind. And she also did it at the same time telling the press, she would go out there and she would project herself to the media as somebody who did not work hard. It wasn't because she didn't want to seem like she was she had to do this for money or that she was a hard worker. So she was out there telling people, I only work a few hours a day, a few days a week. I only work with a box of chocolates at hand and a rose in my mouth and a bottle of champagne. So she really tried to make it seem like she was not working hard either.
Fabulous. The other part that I thought was, because of that narrative structure that you use, I thought it was especially helpful at the end to have the list of all the books finally, and you can see they're all dated, and you can really run down and get a sense of just this incredible output. And I think it was a very, very successful narrative choice. There was quite a bit of discussion in the book about the quality of her writing, but you return to this fact that wasn't the point of this whole project, right? And I think regardless of your opinion on her writing, you cannot deny that she was an innovator, right? And one of the things that, there was a quote from the Washington Independent Review of Books that I thought summed it up really well, and it says, Wells wrote at a time when the conventions of mystery writing were just being settled on. If her work was formulaic, it must be admitted that she helped invent the formula. And I thought that was so poignant about her influence. And that's part of this book as well, right? This development of genre fiction at the dawn of the 20th century. And they start to get this breakdown between what's considered high and low literature, good and bad literature. And unfortunately, Carolyn often finds herself critically on the low end. And so I was wondering if you got a sense that she kind of cared. I mean, you describe her in the book as marvelously unapologetic, which is what I aim to be. But do you have a sense that she had a feeling about this at all?
I think, I mean, I know that she would say that I write to amuse, I write to entertain. I think in literature, if not in life, she was a populist. She believed that, books were for fun. They didn't have to be, difficult or hard to read or literature with a capital L. But do I also believe that she was innovating in the genres, that she might not have been trying to innovate? I think she was just out there just doing the work, and that's the way it turned out. And one of the, you're right when you say, one of the things I think is really interesting about Carolyn's work is that people will say, well, was it any good? Is it any good? Which is such an odd question because everything is so subjective anyway. But I love to look at what actual readers thought. And I think one of the ways you can look at that is by looking at library records. And so when I came across that library study that said she was one of the top most borrowed authors, Zane Grey was #1, so if that gives you any idea of, what the kind of material is being checked out. And Virginia Woolf was unfortunately like 341 on the list. So, people like what they like. They like a little escapism, and she was able to give that to them.
That's right. I mean, and that exists today, right? I mean, there is kind of like a sneering at genre fiction, but I think we persist in liking what we like, so it will continue on. So I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about Carolyn as collector, because that's the other really important thing. And I do want to encourage everyone to take a look at the display later. There's some really fantastic selections from Carolyn's collection, and there's some pieces that I had never seen before that came out for this display, so I really do hope you check it out. So how did someone like Carolyn, a single woman in New Jersey who writes these nonsense limericks and verses and some children's books and mystery novels, how does she start collecting books?
Well, I think she had actually always had the idea that she liked to collect. As a child, she liked collecting bits and pieces, rocks and things like that, but actually this was really discouraged. And she writes in an article in The Atlantic in 1926 that she was meant to, her parents made it clear to her that collecting was a masculine verb. It was not something for her to be doing. It was okay for her brother, but it wasn't okay for her. But that's the kind of thing that, collecting is typically they call it a bug, they call it a gene. It's something you have in you and it's not going to go away. So it was always there. And I think what happens to her, she collects here and there her whole life, various objects, various books. But when she does actually get married, I mentioned that before, but her husband dies about 16 months after they're married, and he leaves her some money. She turns her, because she's also sad, needs to turn her attention to something. She has 3 good friends, one being Harriet Sprague, who I mentioned before, one being a man named A. Edward Newton, who was pretty famous at the time, of a man of letters and book collector, and one being Belle DeCosta Green, this librarian at the Morgan Library. And they all said to her, turn your attention to books. That's what you should be collecting. And also, it should be Walt Whitman. So they kind of told her what to do and what to focus on, and she was definitely the kind of person that once she had a goal in mind, there was nothing that was going to stop her.
It definitely seems that way. Everything she picks up, she just goes full force, and I think that's so amazing. So we can definitely say that she was a successful collector. I mean, as you mentioned, her bibliography, or the checklist, I should say, let's not oversell it, but her checklist was, for about 50 to 70 years, the standard bibliography for the field of Whitman collecting. This is incredibly significant. And she had said at some point that, she spoke to Belle DeCosta Green and she gave her her first auction catalogs to read, and that it kept her up all night, and it was just so gripping. And so I kind of picture her taking that experience and putting it into the checklist. So I really love that. Now, she passed away in 1942 and bequeathed her library of Whitman to the Library of Congress. It was one of the few kind of chunks of her material that she put in a particular place. And we are incredibly grateful to have this material. And again, it's in the back, so do take a look. But I did want to kind of switch gears now and talk about your research journey. So the books came here, and so you knew you were going to come here eventually, and you did visit several different kind of divisions in the library. Can you speak a little bit about your journey to the library and how you found it here, and just speak a little bit about your time here?
And the way I found out that the collection was here was basically from a New York Times article that came out. It's in 1942, just a few weeks after her death. You know, there were standard obituaries, and then a few weeks later, there's this article saying, oh, by the way, she donated her collection to the Library of Congress. It's like a paragraph or two. It's almost nothing. And her family, when I reached out to them, they said, well, we thought it was at the New York Public Library. So there was a little bit of a question of, is it really here? Is it really? And I did know that at least 3 auctions had happened in her lifetime of her material. So I thought, I guess she just had a ton of material. But once I found out that the collection was here, I was talking to a librarian named Michael North, and he was able to let me know where the collection, how it was cataloged, gave me a list, and said this is all I know about it. There was no other further material. There was no kind of highlighting on the website. There was no, in my mind, there wasn't a lot of
Fanfare.
Yeah, not fanfare around her collections, mostly because you have 2 other really amazing Walt Whitman collections that really overshadowed the gift that she gave in 1942. So, it's not like, her collection was of books, theirs was of manuscript material, and that tends to be a little more valued for its scholarship. So that's how I found out about the library, and then I always knew doing this research the library was going to be on my list of places to go. I couldn't go to every library where I found bits and pieces of her material because they're all over the place, because they were scattered at auction. It's like a letter here and a box over here and a couple of manuscripts over there. So I knew I was never going to get to all of them. I could send away for digital files, but there were certain libraries that I knew I was going to have to visit in person, and this was one of them. And it was mostly because I just kind of wanted to sit and commune with her books. I didn't know that I was going to learn anything from them. I just knew I wanted to be with her collection, the collection that she had slated to be saved for a reason.
Yeah,
that's really it.
Absolutely. And like you said, I mean, she gave it to the Library of Congress, giving it to the nation, right? I mean, and now it is available for everybody. And, you mentioned that there were a lot of places to visit because everything is so scattered. And you also had run into some pretty real hang-ups. I mean, there were floods in archives that you encountered, and then, more than anything else, COVID came along and shuttered many institutions for months on end. And I guess I was just wondering, could this book have come to be and come together without modern research methods, digitized copies of books, digital archives, online catalogs, things of that nature? Would it totally have been, I don't know.
I think it would have been pretty impossible, or it would have taken a decade of just doing nothing else but that. Because so much of the research was, digital sources, databases, right. Kind of sifting through. I would plug her name into a database, like the Periodicals Research Database Index, and I'd get 3,000 results because she had written tons of material, and I'd sift through every single one of those citations, If you plug her name into the New York Times Index, 785 citations are going to come back at you. And that's cool. That's very fun. Yeah. And yes, the archives are all scattered all over the place because things were bought at auction, donated to institutions, or things were bought at auction and a private collector has them. So not only was I looking for archives and institutions, I was also kind of putting the word out among booksellers and collectors that I know. Hey, does anybody collect Carolyn Wells, or anybody in her circle, and do you think they'd have anything? And that actually worked too, to have people email me back and say, oh yeah, I do know somebody, and reach out to him. So it was a very scattershot method of research.
Well, the archive was scattershot. Exactly. You had to do what you had to do.
Right.
So what's interesting, I think, is that not only is it clear that these digital resources were incredibly important to your research process, but it was also an incredibly physical process. I mean, you're running around Rahway, New Jersey, tracing, scraps of things, and then 2 years of reaching out to booksellers, and there's a physical labor there too. Looking back, would you have approached any of your process differently?
Yeah, I think about it a lot, and one of the things I think about is that I wish I had had one more year to work on it, because the archive is all over the place. You know, you go into a database like WorldCat, and plug her name in, and there's a lot of sifting to be done, and so you're going to miss things. And as my book was published, literally like the month before it came out in stores, my agent actually published something on Facebook, like, "Oh, we're going to buy this book." And a friend of hers chimed in and said, "Oh, I think there's a collection of her letters at Williams College." And I was like, "Oh, no."
The last thing you want to hear.
Really, kind of, but also great, because great, there's letters. So I kind of dropped everything and drove to Williams College and looked through it all. And there was no bombshells necessarily, but there was a lot of really personal, she was writing to her best friend Harriet, and so there was material about like their friendship, about her husband dying, about her mother dying, about how she kind of got over those deaths, and so it would have added a certain element to the book that it might be missing, and also it would have been great to quote from those letters, but so I wish I had a little more time, because I think I would have been able to ferret out a little bit more.
Well, maybe there's a part 2. I just think that we can probably, I guess my next question really is, what are you hoping to see happen now for Carolyn? One idea that comes to my mind, because we are talking about scattered archives, is, in this world of digital media, can there be some online assembled digital archive? Or, is there some other way we can reunite the Carolyn archive? Or, I don't know. Something.
I love that idea. It seems like it would be a labor of love.
Oh, yeah. Well, everything we do in libraries is a labor of love. We're here because we love it.
I don't know. I can get to work on that. A digital archive of links to everything I found, and put a call out to everyone. If you have anything, just one of the major thing I wanted to do with this book was just to bring her name back into the conversation. If we're talking about Agatha Christie, if we're talking about Mary Roberts Reinhardt, which is another of her competitors at the time, if we're talking about Ellery Queen, or if we're talking about any of those early Golden Age mystery authors, I want her name to be remembered. And so many of the mid-century and male critics from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, they left her name out, or they put it in a footnote, or they called her names like Beldam, which I actually had to look up, and it's like crone, witch, or hag. So, there's a little bit of that going on at mid-century that I feel like needs to be remedied.
Agreed.
And while I would love to see some of her books reprinted, although so many of them are in the public domain now, that if you have a good library app, you can download them. You can read them yourself.
This is true. Well, thank you so much. I would like to give time to the audience.
All right, so we are going to open this up to questions. It looks like we already got one, so I'm going to go ahead and hand it over. But before I give you the microphone, just please raise your hand, and I will bring you the mic. The reason why is that we are recording, so we want everybody to be able to hear your questions.
Rebecca, Carolyn died in 1942, and could you fill us in on how her work did vanish?
Yeah, I kind of, in my mind and in the book, break it into really 3 different things I think happened. One is that there was a certain amount of misogyny that she came up against in almost everything she did. You heard before, no women contributors. There was a little bit of that. There was a little bit of reviewers saying things like, women can't write detective novels. They just don't know about these kinds of things. I mean, it sounds crazy to us now, but that was happening. I think a certain amount had to do with what we were talking about before, genre fiction, young adult, mystery novels. They weren't considered literature, and today even they kind of struggle for that kind of, to be a literature with a capital L. So they were considered ephemeral, and so maybe weren't going to be remembered, and that was okay. I mean, even she would probably agree with that. I wrote for today and not for tomorrow, kind of thing. But I think the biggest thing that happened to her is that she died without really naming a literary executor or agent or anybody who could carry on her name. So, during World War II, the paperback boom is just happening in this country, and would all of her 61 detective novels have been great in paperback? Yes, but there was nobody to go to the publisher and say, put them in paperback, put a garish cover on it and put it in the drugstore, and thereby like keep her name alive for 10 or 20 or 30 more years. There wasn't anybody to do that, and if you're not on the shelves in the bookstore and the libraries weed you out after 10 or 20 years, then that's it. You can very easily fall off the map.
One of the things that is sort of amazing is that it was the Mystery Society who asked Carolyn to write a book on how to write a mystery, which sort of amazed me. I will also say, as a member of the family, we are delighted that she did this.
Yes, applause are necessary on that one.
Hi, yeah, I have two questions actually. My first one is about her connection with Theodore Roosevelt and whether or not she maintained a family tie, or was she friends with Eleanor Roosevelt or any other politicians at that time? And my second question is, why Carolyn Wells? What drew you to her initially, and was there anyone else you were researching when you found her name?
Those are two big questions. Theodore Roosevelt, yeah, they kept up a correspondence. She also had a correspondence with the Hoovers, Mr. and Mrs. Hoover. They would like go to dinner together and like invite each other to the theater. Wilson, who was a detective novel lover, he wrote to her as well, and so did FDR, which FDR actually wrote to her and said something like, one of these days I'm going to write a mystery novel. And then he did. He hired a bunch of ghostwriters, and like a year or two later, he published like the President's detective novel, which I don't know why he didn't ask her to do it. I was almost angry when I heard about that. So yeah, I mean, they were probably not deep friendships, but they were probably something a little bit more than an acquaintance. And how did I come to know the name Carolyn Wells? I mean, it's kind of a long story. My husband, for my birthday in 2011, he bought me a first edition of Walden, which is a book that's always been my favorite book in American literature. And inside is a bookplate of Carolyn Wells. And it didn't really, there was another bookplate too, Sir Edmund Goss, who's a pretty famous English critic. And so it didn't really strike me as, just sort of interesting. Here's a woman collector. Women collectors were pretty rare then, and today they're also kind of rare, but then even more. And so it took me a long time, like 8 or 9 years, to really figure out who she was, because I kind of just forgot about it. I put it on a shelf. And then in 2018, 2019, I found out that this British publisher was putting out a new edition of Murder in the Bookshop. And it was like a light, oh, this is the Carolyn Wells. Oh, she was a mystery author, and she was a book collector. And I thought, oh, I'm going to write an article about this, because I was a journalist. And I did write that article, but in the process of writing that article, doing the research, I reached out to this scholar, Dr. Margaret Stetz at the University of Delaware, who's one of the only scholars who's done any kind of scholarship, any kind of scholarly articles about Carolyn Wells. And she told me all about the comedy and the comic verse and the parody. And I thought, how do I not know the name of this woman who was excelling in all these different spaces? And then I started putting together like a checklist, a bibliography of her work, and came up with about 180, and that might not even be complete. And I thought, how do I not know her name? And so, and at the time, if you Googled her name, you'd find a couple of little paragraph here, paragraph there. The information was conflicting. They didn't know what year she was born, where she grew up. And I thought, this has to be remedied. I got to do something about this. So that's kind of where it started.
Thank you so much, both of you. I was wondering if you spoke a little bit about how in the conversation about mystery writing from the period, she was significant, and then we've forgotten her, and she was writing a little earlier than, say, somebody like Christie. I was wondering, is there anything of what she wrote early that you can see influenced later people that we do remember? Can we sort of trace a kind of narrative there, or is it more in the sort of maybe more genre-wide features that she was working in?
I don't know if I can answer that, but I do know that there's a scholar named Stephen Knight who claims that some of Agatha Christie's plots could very easily be traced to Carolyn Wells. And because Carolyn was writing a decade before her, and all of her books were being published in England as well, I can see how it might have happened. But I also think at that time, there were certain ways in which people wrote that, I think they're all writing similar plots and similar styles. And so, if somebody's stealing a little bit from the other person, they don't really know, and nor do they care.
There are many ways to develop a collection. And you've been addressing a great deal, and I'm learning a great deal about Carolyn as an author. But I'd like to know a little more about her as a collector. How did she go about it? What were her resources? Did she specialize in specific authors, time period, genre, what?
Yes. She actually started out, she collected some detective fiction early on, gave up on that, gave it away to somebody. And then for herself, she collected Edward Lear was one of her favorites, doing nonsense verse. Lewis Carroll was another huge favorite of hers. And then her friends told her to collect Walt Whitman. And, she kind of went ahead with that. And in collecting Whitman, it's funny, she didn't wait for luck or for anyone to come to her with books. As soon as she decided, I'm going to do this, she wrote like 200 letters to booksellers all around the world, basically saying, I'm collecting Walt Whitman now. What do you have? I'll buy it. Just send me a quote, basically. And that's how in 2 or 3 years she had this big, amazing collection. And I said before that it kind of earned her an enemy, and that enemy was a man named Vincent Starrett, who was also a collector and also a mystery author, so they were kind of competing in the realm. But he said of her that she was as good at collecting like hat pins as she was, books. So he kind of said some mean things about her. He also said like kind of vicious things about her, but I won't get into that. But he had an idea that you go out and you hunt for your books. You go to bookshops and you dig through 10-cent bins and you find a treasure. And she was like, I don't have time for that. I'm just going to write to all the booksellers and they're going to tell me what they have and I'm going to buy it. And, she had money and he did not. And so I'm sure that was also part of the jealousy there.
So I'm going to let everybody think for 1 second while I ask my question. We're thinking about Carolyn Wells, but I really appreciate that you brought up Bella Costa Green. That you and I were talking a little bit earlier about Rebecca Romney's new book about the women that influenced Jane Austen. It's in the air right now, right? I mean, do you feel that? Do you feel like we are in this moment of kind of rediscovery of these women as authors, as collectors, as influencing, one another or sort of the larger genre of literature or collecting? I mean, are we in a moment right now?
I hope so. I'm actually just finishing Rebecca Romney's book, and throughout, I'm like seeing so many parallels that, yeah, I really hope so. And I think women collectors, they have got to be on the upswing. I think, we have the money, we have the agency, we have the intelligence, we have the desire. There's no reason why we can't be at the book fairs collecting like everyone else. It's funny, Carolyn was never able to join any kind of book collecting club for women because it did not exist, and because all of the book collecting clubs were for men only. And they were for men only well into the 70s and 80s, and I actually think there still might be one.
Yeah.
I'm not going to name names, but I know there's still one. So there's been a movement to keep us out. And yeah, maybe this is the pushback.
As women that are in the rare book field, we are happy to have this message from you, so thank you, Rebecca. I'm going to open it up to any last questions that we may have. If we don't, we're going to go ahead and move on to our book signing, and I highly encourage you to take a look at the beautiful material that we pulled out of our vault from the Rare Book and Special Collections Division that's also at the back of the room. Any last questions for Rebecca? All right, we're going to go ahead and thank her then.